car sits abandoned by the water. Keys in the ignition, phone on the passenger seat. The driver's door hangs open like a scream frozen in time. The person who should have been sitting in that seat would never come home. But here's what nobody knew. The man leading her search already knew exactly where she was. June 14th, 2009, Norman, Oklahoma, a town where Negroes still borrowed sugar without knocking, where high school football games brought the entire community together every Friday night, where doors stayed unlocked because nothing bad ever happened here. Until it did. 18-year-old Isabella Chen had 3 weeks left before starting her nursing program at the University of Oklahoma. Straight-A student, volunteer at the local animal shelter. The kind of daughter who still called her mom every night when she stayed out past 9. That night, Isabella told her roommate she was driving to Lake Thunderbird to clear her head before finals, a 20-minute drive she'd made countless times. She took her phone, her keys, and left behind a mystery that would haunt Norman for over a decade. By midnight, her Honda Civic was found on the lake's north shore, engine running, headlights cutting through the darkness. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from her worried roommate. But Isabella was gone. Within hours, Norman police launched the largest missing person search in the town's history. Officer Marcus Rivera coordinated ground teams. Detective Lisa Zhang handled media relations. And leading the entire operation, the man everyone trusted most, Officer Daniel Brooks. Brooks had been at Norman PD for 12 years, decorated, respected. The officer parents requested when their teenagers got in trouble because he actually cared about helping kids turn their lives around. He worked 18-hour days searching for Isabella, knocked on every door within a 5-mile radius, personally interviewed over 200 potential witnesses. "We will not rest until Isabella comes home," Brooks told reporters, his voice heavy with determination. This community doesn't give up on its own. Behind him, Isabella's parents clutched each other, finding comfort in his promise. They had no idea they were staring at their daughter's killer. Week 1. Bloodhounds tracked Isabella's scent to the lake's edge, then lost it. Brooks suggested she might have been taken by boat, a theory that sent search teams in the wrong direction for crucial days. Week 2. A witness claimed to see Isabella's car speeding towards Interstate 35. Brooks personally drove that route, returning empty-handed. He never mentioned that he'd been the one who planted that false lead. Month 1. Tips flooded in. Secret boyfriend theories, human trafficking rings, cult kidnappings. Brooks investigated every single lead with tireless dedication, always coming back with the same report. Dead end. What nobody realized was that Brooks wasn't just investigating the case. He was controlling it. Late at night when the station was empty, Brooks would log into the case management system, deleting witness statements that placed him near the lake that night, modifying timestamps on security footage, redirecting investigations towards theories he knew would lead nowhere. Most people trust police to protect them, but what happens when the protector becomes the predator? Subscribe if you want to know the warning signs before it's too late. By 2010, the Isabella Chen case had gone cold. The task force disbanded. The daily searches ended. Brooks returned to regular patrol duties, occasionally mentioning Isabella to her parents when he saw them around town. "Still thinking about her," he'd say, shaking his head sadly. Never giving up hope. The perfect performance of a caring officer who had done everything he could. In 2012, Brooks received the Norman PD Medal of Merit for his exceptional dedication to the Isabella Chen investigation. Isabella's father personally nominated him for the award. The irony was suffocating. Every year on June 14th, the community held a candlelight vigil. Isabella's mother would speak about hope, about never giving up, about trusting that someday they'd have answers. Brooks attended every single one, standing in the back, watching Isabella's family mourn the daughter he'd taken from them. But Brooks wasn't idle. Between 2009 and 2017, he worked dozens of other cases. Missing persons, break-ins, domestic disputes. Each time he was the officer families trusted with their most vulnerable moments. How many other cases had he corrupted? How many other families had unknowingly placed their faith in the very person who destroyed them? Norman moved on, as small towns do. New families arrived. New high school classes graduated. The story of Isabella Chen became local legend, a cautionary tale parents told teenagers about staying safe. But Isabella's case file never closed. It sat in a metal cabinet in the police station basement, collecting dust and secrets. 8 years after Isabella disappeared, Norman was dealing with a new problem. A string of break-ins targeting elderly residents, prescription medication stolen, jewelry missing, the kind of crimes that made his peaceful community question its safety. On March 15, 2017, detectives investigating a burglary at 412 Elm Street made a routine evidence collection: broken glass, fingerprints on a windowsill, and tucked behind a loose floorboard was a single latex glove. The glove contained DNA, not unusual for a crime scene. Detective Vasquez sent it to the state lab for processing, expecting it to match the burglar they'd arrested the week before. The results came back on April 3rd. The DNA didn't match their burglar. It matched evidence collected from Isabella Chen's abandoned car 8 years earlier. Detective Vasquez read the report 3 times, then called the lab to confirm they hadn't made a mistake. The scientist on the phone was certain. Same DNA, same person. The burglar wasn't just a petty criminal. He was connected to Norman's most famous cold case. Within hours, the Isabella Chen case was officially reopened. Detective Vasquez pulled every piece of evidence from storage, every interview transcript, every photograph, every lead that had gone nowhere. She spread it all across the conference room cable like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting 8 years to be solved. The breakthrough was just the beginning. What they found in those files would expose a betrayal so deep, it would shatter everything this town believed about trust. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe now. The DNA from Isabella's car was in the system, which meant the person who'd taken her had been arrested before, had been fingerprinted, had been in police custody. Detective Vasquez ran the full database search and waited for the match. At 11:43 p.m. April 3, 2017, the database returned a hit. The DNA belonged to someone already in the Norman Police Department system. Someone with access to evidence. Someone who'd handled Isabella's case from day one. Someone they'd all trusted completely. Officer Daniel Brooks. At that exact moment, Brooks was finishing his evening patrol, probably thinking about what to watch on Netflix when he got home. Maybe wondering if anyone would ever connect him to that glove he'd carelessly left behind during a burglary gone wrong. No idea that Detective Vasquez was staring at his name on a computer screen, her hands shaking as she reached for her phone to call the police chief. The man who'd spent 8 years searching for Isabella's killer was about to discover something that would terrify him more than any criminal he'd ever chased. Sometimes, the monster isn't hiding in the shadows. Sometimes he's wearing a badge, sitting at the desk right next to yours, asking about your weekend plans, and offering to cover your shift when your kid gets sick. The call that would change everything was about to be made. But first, there were 8 years of lies to unpack, 8 years of manipulation, 8 years of a killer hiding behind the very badge sworn to protect and serve. What Detective Vasquez discovered in those case files would reveal a pattern of deception so calculated, it would make you question everyone you trust. Comment below. Have you ever suspected someone in authority of lying to you? Your story might be more important than you think. The pieces were finally coming together, but the full picture was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Officer Daniel Brooks arrived at the police station on June 15, 2009 at exactly 6:47 a.m., 17 minutes before his shift officially started. His uniform was pressed, his badge polished, his expression showed the perfect balance of concern and determination. He poured himself coffee, black, no sugar, and walked directly to Chief Martinez's office. "Any updates on the Chen girl?" he asked, settling into the chair across from the chief's desk like he'd done this 1,000 times before. Chief Martinez looked up from the missing person report, exhaustion already creeping across his face. "Nothing yet. Her parents are coming in at 8 for another interview." Brooks nodded gravely. "I'll handle it. Built good rapport with them yesterday."
What the chief didn't know was that Brooks had spent the previous 18 hours rehearsing this exact conversation, practicing his facial expressions in the bathroom mirror, perfecting the tone of voice that conveyed just the right amount of professional concern without seeming overeager. "Good," Chief Martinez said. "Media's already sniffing around. Last thing we need is CNN turning this into another missing white girl circus." Brooks leaned forward slightly. "Want me to coordinate with Detective Zhang on media strategy? Keep the focus on finding Isabella, not feeding the news cycle." "Appreciate that, Brooks. You always think 3 steps ahead." If only he knew how far ahead Brooks was actually thinking. The Chen family arrived at 8:15 a.m. Isabella's mother, Patricia, clutched a thermos of coffee she'd never drink. Her father, Raymond, carried a manila folder stuffed with phone numbers of Isabella's friends, teachers, and co-workers. They'd compiled it at 3 a.m. when sleep became impossible. Brooks met them in the lobby, his handshake firm but not aggressive, his eye contact steady but not intimidating. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen, I know this is incredibly difficult. We're going to do everything possible to bring Isabella home." Patricia Chen's eyes filled with tears. She's never done anything like this, never just disappeared without calling. "Tell me about yesterday," Brooks said, pulling out a notepad. "Walk me through Isabella's entire day." For the next hour, Brooks took detailed notes. Isabella's morning jog, her afternoon study session at the library, her dinner with her roommate, Sofia Martinez. Every detail cataloged with the thoroughness of an officer who genuinely cared about finding answers. What he was really doing was identifying every piece of information that might eventually point toward him. Isabella had told Sofia she was stressed about finals, that she needed to drive somewhere quiet to think. Sofia had offered to come along, but Isabella insisted she needed to be alone. "Did she mention Lake Thunderbird specifically?" Brooks asked. Sofia shook her head, just said she was going somewhere with water, somewhere peaceful. Brooks made a note. Victim chose location spontaneously, no premeditation on her part. "Any boyfriends we should know about?" he continued. "Sometimes people confide in romantic partners about things they won't tell family." Patricia Chen straightened up. Isabella wasn't seeing anyone seriously. She was focused on school. But there might be someone interested in her, someone who'd been pursuing her? Raymond Chen frowned. "You think someone took her?" Brooks set down his pen and leaned back. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen, I don't want to speculate, but we have to consider every possibility. Sometimes people develop obsessions with individuals who don't return their feelings." He was planting seeds, creating alternate theories that would eventually grow into full-scale investigations leading away from him. There was that boy from her biology class, Tyler something. He'd been asking her out for months. She kept saying no, but he didn't seem to get the message. Brooks perked up with genuine interest, not because Tyler was a suspect, but because Tyler was perfect misdirection. Tyler what? Do you know his last name? Hendricks, I think. Tyler Hendricks. Brooks wrote it down with a slight underline. The kind of emphasis that would make anyone reading his notes later think Tyler Hendricks deserved extra attention. "I'll follow up on that today," he promised. After the family left, Brooks drove directly to the University of Oklahoma campus. He found Tyler Hendricks in the library, studying organic chemistry with the desperate focus of someone whose GPA hung in the balance. Tyler was exactly what Brooks had hoped for. Awkward, socially anxious, and clearly harboring a crush on Isabella that bordered on obsession. His backpack was covered in environmental activism stickers. His laptop showed a screensaver of wolves in Yellowstone. The kind of guy who'd make a perfect suspect if you needed one. Brooks introduced himself and suggested they talk outside. Tyler immediately went pale. "Is Isabella okay? Did something happen to her?" "When did you last see Isabella?" Brooks asked, ignoring the question. "Tuesday, I think, in Professor Kim's lecture. Why? What's going on?" Brooks studied Tyler's face carefully. The confusion appeared genuine, but Brooks had learned that appearances could be cultivated. Isabella's missing, Tyler. Her car was found abandoned last night. Tyler's reaction was immediate and visceral. He actually staggered backward, grabbing the nearest bench for support. Missing? What do you mean, missing? I mean, no one's seen her since yesterday evening. Her family's very worried. Tyler ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Brooks recognized as authentic distress. This kid clearly had nothing to do with Isabella's disappearance, which made him absolutely perfect for Brooks's purposes. I need to ask about your relationship with Isabella. Some people mentioned you'd been interested in dating her. Tyler's face flushed red. Yeah, I asked her out a few times.
But she always said no. I respected that. But you kept asking. Not kept asking. I mean, maybe I brought it up more than once, but I wasn't like stalking her or anything. Brooks made another note. Subject admits to repeated romantic advances despite rejection. Where were you yesterday evening, Tyler? At home. Studying. My roommate can verify that. What time did you get home? Around 6, I guess? Had dinner, then studied until like midnight. Brooks nodded thoughtfully. Tyler, I'm going to be straight with you. Isabella's disappearance is being treated as suspicious. That means we'll be talking to everyone who knew her, especially anyone who might have had romantic feelings for her. Tyler's eyes widened. You think someone hurt her? I think Isabella wouldn't just disappear without telling anyone. So either something happened to her, or someone made something happen to her. But I would never... I liked her, but I'd never hurt her. Brooks softened his tone slightly. I'm not accusing you of anything, Tyler, but you need to understand how this looks. You'd been pursuing someone who wasn't interested. Now she's missing. We have to investigate every angle. Tyler nodded frantically. Of course. Whatever you need. I'll take a polygraph, DNA test, whatever. Brooks smiled inwardly. Tyler's eagerness to prove his innocence would only make him look more suspicious to other investigators. The more cooperative he was, the more it would seem like overcompensation for guilt. That might be necessary eventually. For now, just make sure you're available if we need to talk again. Tyler promised he'd stay in Norman for as long as needed. He'd cancel his planned trip home to Tulsa that weekend. He'd give Brooks his class schedule, work schedule, even his gym routine. Perfect. Brooks spent the rest of the day building Tyler Hendricks into a viable suspect.
He interviewed Tyler's roommate, asking questions that implied suspicion without stating it directly. He pulled Tyler's academic records, looking for signs of instability or obsessive behavior. He even drove by Tyler's apartment, noting its proximity to Lake Thunderbird. Every detail was carefully documented in his reports, creating a paper trail that would eventually lead other investigators exactly where Brooks wanted them to go. But Tyler wasn't Brooks's only misdirection strategy. That evening, Brooks attended a community meeting organized by Isabella's family. Nearly 200 people packed into Norman High School's gymnasium, all desperate to help find the missing girl. Brooks stood at the front of the room in his dress uniform, projecting authority and competence. "We need to organize search teams," he announced. "Isabella could be anywhere within a 50-mile radius. Every hour that passes decreases our chances of finding her alive." The crowd murmured anxiously. Patricia Chen wiped her eyes with a tissue that was already soaked through. "All coordinate ground searches," Brooks continued. "We'll divide into teams of 4, each with a designated leader and radio contact. I want every hiking trail, every campground, every abandoned building searched systematically." Volunteers raised their hands eagerly. Isabella's friends from high school, her professors from the university, neighbors who watched her grow up, even strangers who'd only heard about her disappearance on the news. Brooks assigned search zones with military precision. Team 1 would cover the area north of Lake Thunderbird. Team 2 would search the wooded area south of Highway 9. Team 3 would check abandoned structures and construction sites.
What he didn't tell them was that he was deliberately directing them away from where Isabella actually was. Over the next week, Brooks worked 18-hour days. He knocked on doors until his knuckles were raw. He interviewed potential witnesses until his voice was hoarse. He coordinated search efforts with the dedication of someone whose entire career depended on finding Isabella Chen. The performance was flawless. Have you ever watched someone lie so convincingly that you started doubting your own memory? That's exactly what Brooks was doing to an entire town. Comment below if you've ever been manipulated by someone you trusted. Your experience might help others recognize the warning signs. But Brooks's most brilliant deception wasn't what he was doing publicly. It was what he was doing when nobody was watching. Late at night, when the station was empty, Brooks would access the case management system, not to add information, but to modify it. A witness statement that placed him near the lake was quietly edited to change the time from 11:15 p.m. to 10:45 p.m. Security footage timestamps were adjusted by 30 minutes. Phone records showing his location were somehow corrupted during a system update. Each change was subtle, the kind of administrative error that happens in any large investigation. Nothing dramatic enough to raise suspicions, but collectively, they created a completely false timeline that placed Brooks far from Lake Thunderbird when Isabella disappeared. Detective Zhang, overwhelmed with coordinating media requests and managing hundreds of tips, never noticed the inconsistencies. Chief Martinez, dealing with pressure from the mayor and state officials, trusted Brooks to handle the technical details. Why would they question the officer who was working harder than anyone to solve the case? By the end of June, Brooks had successfully created 3 separate lines of investigation that would keep the department busy for months. Tyler Hendricks, the obsessed classmate, a mysterious man in a red pickup truck that multiple witnesses claimed to have seen near the lake, and the possibility that Isabella had been taken by human traffickers operating along Interstate 35. Each theory had just enough evidence to seem credible. Each one led investigators further from the truth. But Brooks's masterpiece wasn't the false leads or the manipulated evidence. It was the way he positioned himself as the case's most dedicated advocate, the officer who cared so much about finding Isabella that he couldn't let go, the professional who took every dead end personally. When Chief Martinez suggested scaling back the active investigation after 3 months, Brooks was the one who argued for keeping it open. "This family deserves answers," he said during a staff meeting. "Isabella deserves justice. We can't just give up because it's getting difficult." His colleagues nodded in agreement. Here was a cop who truly cared about victims and their families, someone who understood that badge meant more than just a paycheck. If they only knew that Brooks was arguing to keep the case active because an active case gave him continued access to evidence and witness statements. As long as he was officially investigating Isabella's disappearance, he could monitor every new lead and control every new direction the case might take. It was the perfect crime, committed by the perfect perpetrator, someone with the authority to investigate his own actions, the trust of everyone around him, and the professional skills to stay one step ahead of his own colleagues. But even perfect crimes have imperfections. Even master manipulators make mistakes. And in March of 2017, during a routine burglary, Brooks would make the kind of careless error that would finally expose 8 years of deception. The glove he left behind wasn't just evidence of a break-in, it was the thread that, when pulled, would unravel his entire carefully constructed lie.
Detective Elena Vasquez had seen enough burglaries to know they usually followed predictable patterns. Smashed windows, missing electronics, prescription bottles scattered across bathroom floors. But the break-in at 412 Elm Street felt different from the moment she stepped through the front door. Mrs. Dorothy Kellman, 73 years old and sharp as a knife despite her age, met Vasquez at the threshold with a cup of coffee and a detailed timeline of everything that had happened. I heard the glass breaking at exactly 2:17 a.m., Dorothy said, consulting a notepad where she'd written everything down in precise handwriting. I looked at the clock specifically because my late husband always said timing matters in situations like this. Detective Vasquez smiled despite herself. Dorothy Kellman was the kind of witness every investigator dreams about. Observant, organized, and completely unintimidated by the violation of her space. I didn't come downstairs until I heard the back door slam shut, Dorothy continued. Then I waited exactly 10 minutes before calling 911. Wanted to make sure whoever it was had actually left. Smart woman. Dorothy had survived the Great Depression, raised 6 children as a single mother, and worked as a bookkeeper for 40 years. She wasn't about to let some punk kid rattle her composure. Detective Vasquez walked through the house methodically. The intruder had entered through a kitchen window, cutting himself on the broken glass based on the blood droplets leading toward the living room. He'd ransacked Dorothy's medicine cabinet, taking her prescribed painkillers, but leaving her blood pressure medication untouched. Selective theft that suggested someone who knew the street value of different pharmaceuticals. In the living room, furniture had been moved away from the walls, picture frames lifted and set aside, the carpet pulled up in one corner. What were they looking for? Vasquez asked. Dorothy shook her head. Nothing valuable is hidden in this house, Detective. Harold and I never had much money to hide. But something nagged at Vasquez as she examined the scene. The search pattern was too systematic, too thorough. This wasn't a junkie looking for quick cash or easy drugs. This was someone hunting for something specific. She called in the crime scene team and spent the next 3 hours cataloging evidence. Fingerprints on the windowsill, blood droplets on the kitchen floor, footprint impressions in the soft soil outside the back door. And tucked behind a loose floorboard in Dorothy's bedroom, a single latex glove. Not unusual to find gloves at a crime scene. Burglars had been watching CSI for years. Most of them knew enough to wear protection. But this glove was different. Instead of being discarded carelessly, it was wedged deliberately behind the floorboard, like someone had been trying to hide it. Detective Vasquez bagged the glove with the same routine efficiency she'd used on hundreds of other pieces of evidence. She had no way of knowing she was holding the key that would unlock Norman's biggest mystery. The DNA results came back on April 3, 2017 at 4:47 p.m. Detective Vasquez was finishing paperwork when her phone rang. Dr. Patricia Webb from the State Crime Lab sounded puzzled. "Elena, I need to double-check something with you about that glove from the Elm Street burglary." "What's the issue?" "Well, we got a hit in the database, but it's not matching your burglary suspect. The DNA belongs to someone else entirely." Vasquez frowned. "Contamination?" "That's what I thought initially, but I ran the test 3 times. Same result every time. The DNA from your glove matches evidence from an 8-year cold case." Vasquez felt her pulse quicken. "Which case?" "Isabella Chen, Norman PD missing person from 2009. The name hit Vasquez like a physical blow. Every cop in Norman knew about Isabella Chen. The nursing student who'd vanished without a trace. The case that had consumed dozens of investigators and hundreds of volunteers. The mystery that had haunted their department for a decade.
"Are you absolutely certain?" Vasquez asked. "Positive. Same DNA profile from evidence collected from the victim's abandoned vehicle. Elena, whoever broke into that house on Elm Street was connected to Isabella Chen's disappearance." Vasquez hung up the phone and stared at the evidence bag containing the glove. Such a small thing. Latex and human skin cells. But it had just connected 2 crimes separated by 8 years and transformed a routine burglary into something much larger. She immediately called Chief Martinez. "Chief, we need to reopen the Isabella Chen case. I think we just found our first real lead in 8 years." Within an hour, the Chen case files were spread across the conference room table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that had been waiting nearly a decade to be solved.
Detective Vasquez had worked plenty of cold cases, but she'd never seen one with this much documentation. Officer Brooks had been thorough. Witness statements, evidence logs, interview transcripts, search coordination reports. Box after box of paperwork meticulously organized and cross-referenced. Brooks really went above and beyond on this one, Chief Martinez observed, flipping through a stack of reports. 300 pages of documentation in the first month alone. Detective Vasquez nodded, but something felt off as she read through Brooks's reports. The writing was too perfect, too comprehensive, like someone who'd been thinking about every detail long before he'd started investigating. Chief, I want to run the DNA against our entire database, not just criminal records, everyone who's ever been fingerprinted in this jurisdiction. You think it's someone local? I think someone who could access Isabella's car after it was impounded would have to be either law enforcement or have connections to law enforcement. Chief Martinez's expression darkened. That's a serious accusation, Alina. It's not an accusation yet. It's just logical deduction. The DNA evidence was collected from Isabella's car after it was processed and stored in our evidence room. Either someone contaminated it accidentally, or someone had legitimate access to that evidence. Run the full database search, Martinez said quietly. But Elena, if this points toward one of our own people, we handle it very carefully, very quietly, until we know exactly what we're dealing with. The database search would take 48 hours. Detective Vasquez used that time to re-examine every piece of evidence from the original investigation with fresh eyes. Isabella's phone records showed her last call at 10:23 p.m. to her roommate Sophia, asking for her dorm room key because she'd forgotten hers. But the call had been made from a cell tower 15 miles north of Lake Thunderbird. If Isabella had been driving to the lake, why was she calling from the opposite direction? The witness who'd reported seeing Isabella's car speeding toward Interstate 35 gave his statement to Officer Brooks personally. But when Detective Vasquez called to follow up, the witness couldn't remember specific details about the car's color or license plate. In fact, he seemed confused about whether he'd actually seen anything at all.
I might have been mistaken, he admitted. It was dark, and I'd been drinking. Officer Brooks seemed to think it was important, so I tried to be helpful. Brooks had built an entire line of investigation around a witness statement that was essentially worthless. The timeline of Isabella's disappearance had always been problematic. Her roommate insisted Isabella had left the dorm at 10:30 p.m. Her car was discovered at 12:15 a.m. But Lake Thunderbird was only a 20-minute drive from campus. What had Isabella been doing for over an hour? Detective Vasquez pulled the original crime scene photos from Isabella's car. The driver's seat had been adjusted for someone much taller than Isabella's 5'4" frame. The rearview mirror was angled incorrectly. Small details that suggested someone else had been driving her car after she'd disappeared. But the most disturbing discovery came when Detective Vasquez cross-referenced the evidence logs with the department's access records. Someone had checked out pieces of evidence from the Isabella Chen case 17 different times over 8 years. Always for re-examination or additional testing. Always returned within 24 hours. Always logged by the same person, Officer Daniel Brooks. Why would the lead investigator need to repeatedly access physical evidence from a case that had already been thoroughly processed? What kind of additional testing required removing evidence from the secure storage facility and taking it home overnight? On April 5, 2017, at 11:43 p.m., Detective Vasquez's phone rang. Dr. Webb from the crime lab sounded tired but excited. Elena, I've got your database results. You're going to want to sit down for this. Detective Vasquez was already sitting, but she gripped the phone tighter anyway. The DNA from the glove belongs to someone in your system, someone with legitimate access to evidence in crime scenes. Who? Officer Daniel Brooks, badge number 247. He's been with your department for, let me see, 16 years. The room seemed to tilt sideways. Detective Vasquez had worked with Brooks dozens of times. He'd trained her when she'd first made detective. He'd been at her promotion ceremony.
He'd sent flowers when her father died. "Are you absolutely certain?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "DNA doesn't lie, Elena. Daniel Brooks's genetic material was on that glove at the burglary scene, and it matches evidence from Isabella Chen's car. Either he's the unluckiest cop in Oklahoma, or he's connected to both crimes." After hanging up, Detective Vasquez sat alone in the conference room, surrounded by 8 years of investigation reports, all meticulously compiled by the man whose DNA had just connected him to Isabella's disappearance. Every witness statement Brooks had taken, every lead he'd followed, every theory he'd developed, all of it suddenly looked different when viewed through the lens of someone who wasn't trying to solve the case, but to control it. The obsessed classmate who'd become the primary suspect? Tyler Hendricks had been investigated for months, subjected to multiple polygraph tests, and eventually cleared when his alibis checked out. But the investigation had consumed enormous resources and diverted attention from other possibilities. The mysterious red pickup truck that multiple witnesses claimed to have seen? Detective Vasquez called each of those witnesses personally. Half of them couldn't remember giving statements about any truck. The other half admitted they'd only mentioned it after Officer Brooks had specifically asked about red vehicles. The human trafficking theory that had sent investigators up and down Interstate 35 for weeks. It was based entirely on Brooks's analysis of regional crime patterns, supported by statistics he'd compiled himself. Every major lead in the Isabella Chen case had originated with Daniel Brooks. Every dead end had been investigated under his supervision. Every piece of evidence had been processed through his hands. He hadn't just been investigating Isabella's disappearance, he'd been orchestrating the entire investigation to protect himself. But why had he made such a careless mistake during a simple burglary? After 8 years of perfect deception, why leave behind evidence that could expose everything? Detective Vasquez pulled the case file from the Elm Street break-in and reread Dorothy Kellerman's statement. The search pattern, the systematic way furniture had been moved, the specific interest in areas where someone might hide valuables or important documents. Brooks hadn't been burglarizing Dorothy Kellerman's house. He'd been searching for something he believed was hidden there. Detective Vasquez called Dorothy directly.
"Mrs. Kelman, this is Detective Vasquez. I need to ask you about your late husband, Harold. Did he ever work in law enforcement?" "Oh, yes," Dorothy replied immediately. "Harold was a police officer for 30 years, retired in 1995. Did he ever work missing persons cases?" "All the time. Harold had a soft spot for families going through tragedy. He'd sometimes work cases even after he'd officially retired, just to help out." Detective Vasquez's blood ran cold. "Mrs. Kelman, did Harold ever mention the Isabella Chen case?" There was a long pause. "Funny you should ask. About 6 months before Harold passed away, he'd gotten very interested in that case. Kept saying something wasn't right about the investigation. He'd been making phone calls, asking questions. Do you know what specifically bothered him?" "He never told me details, but Harold had kept some files from his old cases, and he'd been going through them. Said he wanted to compare investigative techniques or something like that. Brooks hadn't been burglarizing Dorothy Kelman's house for drugs or valuables. He'd been searching for Harold Kelman's files. Files that might have contained evidence or theories that could expose Brooks's role in Isabella's disappearance. But Harold had died of natural causes 2 years earlier, and Dorothy had donated most of his police materials to the department's historical archive. Whatever Harold had discovered about the Isabella Chen case was probably long gone. Except for one latex glove that Brooks had dropped while searching frantically through Harold's old hiding places. One piece of evidence that would finally connect him to the crime he'd spent 8 years covering up. The hunter was about to become the hunted. But first, Detective Vasquez had to figure out how to arrest a fellow officer who'd fooled everyone for nearly a decade.
Subscribe now because what happens next will show you exactly how dangerous it is when the people sworn to protect you become the people you most need protection from. The evidence was overwhelming, the DNA was undeniable, but bringing down Officer Daniel Brooks would require more than scientific proof. It would require exposing 8 years of lies that had fooled an entire police department, an entire community, and a grieving family who'd trusted him with their most precious hope. Detective Vasquez knew she had one chance to get this right, one opportunity to build an airtight case against a fellow officer who'd spent 8 years perfecting his deception. If she moved too quickly, Brooks would destroy evidence. If she moved too slowly, he might disappear entirely. She needed help, but she couldn't trust anyone in her own department. Not yet. At 6:30 a.m. on April 6th, Detective Vasquez drove to Oklahoma City and walked into the office of FBI Special Agent Marcus Chen. No relation to Isabella, the shared surname was pure coincidence, but it felt like fate. Agent Chen listened without interruption as Vasquez laid out the evidence. The DNA match, the manipulated case files, the suspicious pattern of evidence access. When she finished, Chen leaned back in his chair and whistled softly. "Detective, what you're describing isn't just a murder cover-up. It's a systematic corruption of an entire investigation. We're talking about federal charges. I need someone outside Norman PD to help me build this case, someone Brooks can't influence or intimidate." Agent Chen nodded. "Give me 24 hours to get authorization from my supervisor. Then we'll start tearing apart 8 years of lies." While waiting for federal backup, Detective Vasquez began her own quiet investigation into Officer Daniel Brooks. Not the public persona, the dedicated cop everyone admired, but the private man who'd been hiding in plain sight. She started with Brooks's personnel file. 16 years with Norman PD, commendations for bravery, community service awards, glowing performance reviews from supervisors who praised his dedication and attention to detail. But Detective Vasquez was looking for patterns, not praise. Brooks had requested overtime pay for work on the Isabella Chen case 47 times between June 2009 and March 2010. Hundreds of hours billed for investigation activities and evidence review. The department had paid him over $12,000 in overtime compensation for hunting Isabella's killer. He'd literally been paid to cover up his own crime. His vacation requests showed interesting patterns too. Every year on June 14th, the anniversary of Isabella's disappearance, Brooks took personal time off. Not to attend memorial services or visit the family. His requests specifically noted he'd be out of state on those dates. He'd been fleeing Norman every year on the day his victim vanished, like some twisted form of guilt or celebration. Detective Vasquez dug deeper into Brooks's financial records. Police officers made decent money in Norman, but they didn't usually afford lake houses. Brooks had purchased a cabin on Lake Murray in 2011, 2 years after Isabella's disappearance, paying nearly $60,000 in cash.
Where does a cop get $60,000 in cash? She cross-referenced the purchase date with the Isabella Chen case timeline. Brooks had bought his lake house exactly 1 week after the case was officially classified as cold and active investigation was suspended, like he'd been celebrating. But the most chilling discovery came when Detective Vasquez examined Brooks' computer access logs from the police database. Not just the Isabella Chen case, every missing person case that had crossed Norman PD's desk in the past decade. 17 different cases, all involving young women between 18 and 25. All cases where Brooks had either been the lead investigator or had requested to review evidence. Had Isabella Chen been his only victim, or had Norman been dealing with a serial predator hiding behind a badge? Agent Chen called at 3:15 p.m. with authorization to proceed. "We're treating this as a federal investigation now. Public corruption, civil rights violations, and potentially multiple homicides. I'm bringing a full team to Norman tomorrow." "How do we handle Brooks? He's still on active duty."
Very carefully. We need him to feel secure until we're ready to make arrests. If he suspects we're onto him, 8 years of evidence could disappear overnight. The next morning, Detective Vasquez sat in her car outside Brooks's house at 5:30 a.m., watching him follow his normal routine. Coffee on the front porch while reading news on his phone. Load his patrol gear into his personal vehicle. Drive to the station with windows down, radio playing classic rock. He looked like any other cop starting another day of serving and protecting his community. At 8 a.m., Agent Chen and 3 other federal investigators arrived at Norman PD in unmarked vehicles. Chief Martinez had been briefed on the situation and was cooperating fully, though the shock on his face suggested he still couldn't believe one of his officers was a suspected killer. We need to search Brooks's locker, his desk, and his assigned patrol vehicle without him knowing. Can you send him out on a call that'll keep him busy for a few hours? Chief Martinez nodded grimly. There's a domestic disturbance report on the south side of town. Probably nothing serious, but it'll require a full report and witness statements. Brooks was dispatched to the call at 9:15 a.m., completely unaware that federal agents were about to tear apart his professional life. His desk drawers revealed the meticulous organization of someone who never left anything to chance. File folders labeled by case number and date, pens arranged by color and type, a daily planner with appointments scheduled weeks in advance. But hidden in the back of his bottom drawer, wrapped in a manila envelope, Agent Chen found something that made his blood run cold. Photographs. Dozens of them. Not crime scene photos or case evidence, personal photographs that Brooks had clearly taken himself. Isabella Chen walking to her car after work. Isabella Chen studying in the university library. Isabella Chen jogging through the park near her dorm. Photograph after photograph showing Brooks had been stalking Isabella for weeks before her disappearance. The dates written on the backs of the photos confirmed it. Brooks had been following Isabella since late May 2009, almost 3 weeks before she vanished. This wasn't a random crime. This was planned obsession. Brooks's patrol vehicle yielded more evidence. A GPS device hidden under the dashboard showed frequent trips to locations that had never appeared in any of his official reports. The lake house he'd purchased with cash, remote areas near Lake Thunderbird that weren't part of any organized search grid, addresses belonging to Isabella's friends and family members. But the most damning evidence was found in Brooks's locker, a small metal box locked and hidden behind his spare uniforms. Inside, a cell phone that didn't belong to the department, jewelry that matched descriptions from other missing person cases, and a key that Agent Chen suspected opened something at Brooks's lake house.
The cell phone's call log showed numbers that made Detective Vasquez's hands shake. Isabella Chen's number. Called 17 times on June 14, 2009, between 10:30 p.m. and 11:45 p.m., long after Isabella's official last communication with her roommate. Brooks had been calling Isabella's phone while she was missing, either to taunt her while she was held captive, or to create the illusion that she was still alive and in possession of her device. Agent Chen immediately obtained warrants to search Brooks' residence and his lake house. They had to move quickly. Brooks would return from his call within hours, and the moment he realized his personal items had been searched, he'd know the investigation had shifted toward him. The search of Brooks' Norman residence revealed a man living 2 completely different lives. The front rooms were normal. Modest furniture, family photos, the kind of space you'd expect from a bachelor police officer. But his basement told a different story. Wall-to-wall bulletin boards covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and hand-drawn maps. Not just Isabella Chen's case, but every missing person case he'd ever worked. Red string connecting photos to locations to timelines, like something from a serial killer movie. In the center of it all, surrounded by dozens of photos,
was Isabella Chen's high school graduation picture, with her eyes scratched out. Agent Chen documented everything methodically, but privately, he was nauseated. This wasn't just a killer who'd covered his tracks. This was someone who'd been reliving his crimes, obsessing over his victims, and probably planning future attacks for 8 years. The search of Brooks' lake house would have to wait until the following day. Agent Chen wanted a full forensics team present, including cadaver dogs in case there were other victims buried on the property. But they'd already seen enough to know that Officer Daniel Brooks wasn't just Isabella Chen's killer. He was a predator who'd been using his badge to hunt vulnerable women while simultaneously leading the investigations into their disappearances. At 4:30 p.m., Brooks returned to the station from his domestic disturbance call. He seemed relaxed, even cheerful, chatting with colleagues about weekend fishing plans. Detective Vasquez watched him from across the bullpen, wondering how she'd worked alongside this monster for years without seeing the truth. How had none of them noticed? How had Brooks hidden his true nature so completely? "Vasquez," Brooks called out, waving her over. "Heard you caught an interesting burglary case. Dorothy Kelman's place, right? Any decent leads?" The casualness of the question made Detective Vasquez's skin crawl. Brooks was fishing for information about the very case that exposed him, still trying to control the narrative even as federal agents were building evidence for his arrest. "Still working through the evidence," she replied carefully. "You know how these property crimes go." Brooks nodded sympathetically. "Let me know if you need help with anything. I worked a few break-ins in that neighborhood last year. Might be able to spot connections you haven't noticed." He was offering to help investigate the crime that would destroy him. The audacity was breathtaking. That evening, Agent Chen briefed Detective Vasquez on everything they had discovered. The stalking photographs, the trophy jewelry, the basement shrine to his victims. The evidence painted a picture of systematic predation that had been going on for nearly a decade. "We're arresting him tomorrow morning, before his shift starts. We can't risk him destroying evidence or potentially harming someone else." "What about Isabella's body? Do we know where she is?" Agent Chen's expression was grim. "We're hoping the lake house search will provide answers, but Vasquez, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that we may never find her. Brooks has had 8 years to hide the evidence." That night, Detective Vasquez couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Isabella's parents, who'd spent 8 years wondering what happened to their daughter. They'd trusted Officer Brooks completely, believing he was doing everything possible to bring Isabella home. How do you tell parents that the man they'd thanked for his dedication had actually been the one who'd taken their daughter's life? How do you explain that their daughter's killer had attended every candlelight vigil, had shaken their hands at police community events, had looked them in the eyes while lying about bringing Isabella justice? The betrayal went beyond criminal. It was spiritual. It challenged everything people believed about trust, authority, and the fundamental assumption that those sworn to protect and serve actually meant it. But Detective Vasquez also felt something else. Relief. After 8 years, Isabella's family would finally have answers. Not the answers they'd hoped for, but the truth that would allow them to grieve properly and begin healing. And other families, the families of women whose cases Brooks had sabotaged, or whose disappearances he might have caused, would finally understand why justice had been so elusive. At 4:30 p.m. on April 8, 2017, Detective Vasquez sat in an unmarked car outside Brooks' house, waiting for the signal to move in. Agent Chen and his team were positioned at strategic points around the property. Brooks' alarm clock went off at 6 a.m., just like always. He stumbled to his kitchen and started the coffee maker, completely unaware that his 8-year deception was about to end. At 6:15 a.m., as Brooks stepped onto his front porch with his morning coffee, Agent Chen approached with credentials raised and backup visible in every direction. "Daniel Brooks, FBI, you're under arrest for the murder of Isabella Chen and violation of civil rights under color of law."
Brooks's coffee mug slipped from his fingers and shattered on the concrete steps. For the first time in 8 years, his perfect composure cracked. The mask was finally off. But the real shock wasn't Brooks's arrest, it was what they found when they searched his lake house later that morning. Evidence that would prove Isabella Chen wasn't his only victim, and that Norman, Oklahoma had been home to something far more sinister than anyone had imagined. Don't miss the horrifying discovery that turned a single murder case into one of Oklahoma's largest serial killer investigations. Subscribe now, because what comes next will change how you think about trusting people in positions of authority forever. The officer who'd promised to protect and serve had been doing neither. He was hunting.
Agent Chen had investigated serial killers before, but he'd never searched a property, knowing the suspect had been leading the investigation into his own crimes for 8 years. As the forensics team assembled outside Brooks' lake house on April 8, 2017, Chen couldn't shake the feeling they were about to uncover something that would redefine everything they thought they knew about this case. The lake house sat on 3 isolated acres, surrounded by dense woods and accessible only through a single dirt road. The perfect location for someone who needed absolute privacy for activities that couldn't be witnessed. Brooks had chosen his hunting ground well. The main structure was modest, a 2-bedroom cabin that looked like any weekend retreat owned by middle-class professionals. But appearances, as they'd already learned with Brooks, meant absolutely nothing. The forensics team started with ground-penetrating radar, scanning the property for anomalies that might indicate buried remains. What they found made Agent Chen's blood run cold. 7 distinct disturbances in the soil. 7 areas where the earth had been dug up and refilled within the past decade. 7 potential graves scattered across Brooks' property like a macabre treasure map. "We're going to be here for weeks," the lead forensic specialist told Agent Chen grimly. "Each site needs to be excavated methodically. This isn't just a crime scene, it's an archaeological dig." While the dig team prepared their equipment, Agent Chen and Detective Vasquez entered the cabin itself. The living room and kitchen were unremarkable, but a locked door in the back hallway required a warrant-authorized force entry. Behind that door lay the true heart of Brooks's operation. The room was part workshop, part shrine, part torture chamber. Metal tables with restraint points, soundproofing materials covering every wall, cameras positioned at multiple angles, and covering every available surface, photographs. Hundreds of them. Not just Isabella Chen, though she was prominently featured. Dozens of other young women, all photographed without their knowledge over a period of years. Walking to their cars, leaving work, entering their apartments, shopping at grocery stores. Each woman had her own dedicated section of wall space, complete with personal information Brooks had somehow obtained. Home addresses, work schedules, class timetables for those who were students, family information. The comprehensive stalking profiles of a predator who'd been systematically hunting multiple victims simultaneously. Detective Vasquez recognized some of the faces immediately. Angela Rodriguez, missing since 2011, reported as a possible runaway because she'd been having problems at home. Brooks had been the responding officer who'd taken her parents' missing person report. Melissa Turner vanished in 2013 while jogging near Lake Thunderbird. Her case had gone cold after Brooks determined she'd probably been attacked by a transient who'd moved on from the area. Samantha Walsh disappeared in 2015 after her car was found abandoned near Interstate 35. Brooks had convinced investigators she'd likely been taken by human traffickers, a theory that had sent resources towards a multi-state task force that found nothing. 4 women whose disappearances Brooks had investigated. 4 women whose cases he'd steered toward dead ends and false theories. 4 women whose faces now stared out from his trophy wall like hunting prizes. "Agent Chen," one of the forensic specialists called from outside, "you need to see this." The first excavation site had revealed human remains. Female, young adult, based on bone development, buried approximately 8 years ago based on soil analysis and decomposition patterns. Isabella Chen had been found. But she wasn't alone.
Over the next 6 days, as forensics teams carefully excavated Brooks's property, they uncovered the remains of 6 women. 6 lives ended by the man who'd sworn to protect them. 6 families who trusted Officer Brooks to find their missing daughters, never knowing he'd already killed them. The DNA evidence confirmed what Detective Vasquez had feared. Isabella Chen, Angela Rodriguez, Melissa Turner, Samantha Walsh, and 2 other women whose identities would take weeks to confirm through dental records and missing person databases from surrounding counties. Brooks hadn't just been Norman's most dedicated missing persons investigator. He'd been Norman's most prolific serial killer. The pattern was always the same. Identify a vulnerable young woman through his police work, stalk her for weeks or months while building a psychological profile, engineer a reason to interact with her professionally, a traffic stop, a safety check, a response to a minor incident, gain her trust through his badge and uniform, then isolate her. The kills weren't random crimes of opportunity. They were carefully planned executions carried out by someone who understood exactly how missing persons investigations worked, because he'd be the one conducting them. Agent Chen spent hours reviewing Brooks's personnel files, trying to understand how a serial killer had operated within law enforcement for over a decade without raising suspicion. The answer was both simple and terrifying. His arrest record was outstanding. His community involvement was exemplary. His relationship with victims' families was characterized by empathy and dedication. He'd attended their daughters' funerals when bodies were found. He provided updates on cases long after other officers would have moved on. He'd been exactly what grieving families needed from law enforcement, because he'd known exactly what to say and do to deflect suspicion from himself. The basement workshop contained detailed journals documenting each murder. Not the remorseful confessions of someone struggling with guilt, but the methodical record-keeping of someone who viewed his crimes as professional accomplishments. Isabella's entry was 67 pages long. It began with his first sighting of her at a coffee shop near the university and continued through weeks of surveillance, planning, and eventually the night he'd killed her. According to Brooks's own written account, he'd approached Isabella at Lake Thunderbird where she was sitting alone, processing stress about her upcoming finals. He'd been in civilian clothes, driving his personal vehicle, but had identified himself as a police officer responding to reports of suspicious activity in the area.
Isabella had trusted him completely. Why wouldn't she? He was law enforcement. He was there to help keep her safe. Brooks had convinced Isabella to accompany him to his patrol car to file a report about what she'd observed at the lake. Once she was in the vehicle, he'd used a chemical restraint, chloroform, obtained through evidence room access, to incapacitate her. He'd driven her to his lake house, where she'd remained alive for 3 days while Brooks tortured her physically and psychologically. His journal entries during this period revealed someone who took pleasure not just in violence, but in the power dynamic of a victim who'd initially trusted him. Isabella had died on June 17, 2009, 3 days after her disappearance. 3 days while her family organized search parties, and Brooks pretended to look for her body. Agent Chen had to take several breaks while reading Brooks's journals. The level of detail was nauseating, but it was also crucial evidence that would ensure Brooks never had the opportunity to harm anyone else. The journals revealed something else that horrified investigators. Brooks had been planning his retirement. His final entry, dated just 2 weeks before his arrest, outlined his intention to leave Norman PD within the next year and relocate to a different state where he could start fresh with new opportunities. He'd been preparing to move his operation, to find new hunting grounds where his law enforcement experience would help him integrate quickly into another police department, gain the trust of another community, and begin stalking new victims. The arrest had stopped him just months before he would have disappeared and begun killing in a new jurisdiction. Detective Vasquez spent her evenings visiting the families of Brooks's victims, delivering news that was simultaneously devastating and relieving. Devastating because it confirmed their worst fears about their missing daughters. Relieving because it finally provided answers to questions that had haunted them for years.
Raymond Chen, Isabella's father, took the news with the stoic dignity of someone who'd been preparing for this conversation for 8 years. "We knew she was gone," he said quietly. "Part of us knew from the beginning, but we needed to know why. We needed to know who." Patricia Chen, Isabella's mother, had a different reaction. "He came to our house," she whispered. "Officer Brooks came to our house for dinner twice. We thanked him. We told him he was like family." The betrayal was almost incomprehensible. Brooks hadn't just killed their daughter, he'd violated their grief, manipulated their hope, and accepted their gratitude while knowing he was the cause of their suffering. "How many other people are like him?" Patricia asked. "How many other police officers are doing things like this?" Detective Vasquez didn't have an answer. Brooks's crimes had shattered her faith in the very institution she dedicated her career to serving. If a decorated officer could operate as a serial killer for over a decade without detection, what else might be happening in law enforcement agencies across the country? The psychological evaluation of Brooks, conducted while he awaited trial, revealed a textbook psychopath who'd chosen law enforcement specifically because it provided access to potential victims and cover for his crimes. He showed no remorse for his actions and seemed genuinely puzzled by the emotional reactions of his victims' families. "I was very good at my job," Brooks told the court-appointed psychiatrist. "I solved more missing person cases than anyone else in the department." He'd solved them because he'd caused them. He'd been both the arsonist and the firefighter, creating problems he could then appear to address while actually ensuring they were never truly resolved. The ripple effects of Brooks's arrest extended far beyond Norman. Law enforcement agencies across Oklahoma began reviewing their own cold cases, looking for patterns that might indicate other officers had been involved in crimes they'd investigated. The FBI launched a broader investigation into potential corruption within small-town police departments, focusing specifically on missing person cases handled by single investigators with unusual access to evidence. And families across the region began questioning cases they'd previously accepted as unsolvable mysteries. If Officer Brooks could fool everyone for 8 years, how many other trusted authority figures were hiding similar secrets? But perhaps the most disturbing revelation came during Brooks's interrogation after his arrest. When pressed on his motivations, he showed no anger, no defensiveness, no emotional response at all. "People trust uniforms," he said matter-of-factly. "They see a badge and they stop thinking critically. They assume you're there to help them, so they lower their guard. It's not complicated psychology." He'd weaponized the public's trust in law enforcement. He'd turned the very symbol that was supposed to represent safety into a tool for predation. Agent Chen had seen plenty of criminals attempt to justify their actions, but Brooks never bothered with justification. He simply described his methods like someone explaining a successful business strategy. "The key's patience," Brooks continued during one interrogation session. "Don't rush. Build rapport first. Make them feel safe, then they'll go anywhere with you willingly." Even in custody, facing multiple murder charges, Brooks was still thinking like a predator, still analyzing his techniques, still completely devoid of any recognition that his victims were human beings whose lives had value. The trial would begin in 6 months. The evidence was overwhelming. The DNA conclusive. Brooks's own journals damning beyond any possibility of acquittal. But for the families of his victims, the trial wouldn't bring closure. It would simply be the official acknowledgement of a truth they'd already been forced to accept. The man they'd trusted to find their daughters had been the one who'd taken them away. The web of deception Brooks had woven hadn't just hidden his crimes. It had corrupted the very concept of justice, turning protection into predation, and making a mockery of every promise law enforcement makes to the communities it serves. Comment below if you've ever had your trust violated by someone in authority. Your experience matters because recognizing these patterns could save lives.
The full horror of Daniel Brooks's crimes was now exposed. But the question that haunted everyone involved in the case wasn't just how he'd gotten away with it for so long. It was how many others like him were still out there, hiding behind badges, waiting for their next opportunity to hunt. The Norman Police Department had never experienced anything like the media circus that descended on their quiet town after Brooks's arrest. CNN, NBC, Fox News, every major network wanted the story of the cop who'd hunted his own cases. The department's phone rang constantly with interview requests, book deal offers, and documentary proposals. Chief Martinez fielded the chaos with grim professionalism, but privately he was devastated. 30 years of law enforcement experience, and he'd never suspected that one of his most trusted officers was a serial killer. "How did I miss it?" he asked Detective Vasquez during a late-night conversation in his empty office. 16 years I worked with that man. 16 years of performance reviews, community events, department barbecues. My kids called him Uncle Danny. Detective Vasquez didn't have an answer. None of them did. Brooks had been so convincing, so thoroughly integrated into their professional family, that discovering his true nature felt like learning a fundamental law of physics had been wrong. The arrest had shattered more than just one case. It had broken the department's confidence in its own judgment, its ability to recognize threats, its capacity to protect the community it served. But the real destruction was happening in the homes of Norman's residents, where parents were having conversations they'd never imagined needing to have. How do we tell our children to trust police officers when a police officer was the monster? One mother asked during a packed town hall meeting 3 days after Brooks's arrest. Mayor Catherine Wells tried to provide reassurance, but her words sounded hollow even to herself. Officer Brooks was an aberration, one individual who betrayed everything law enforcement stands for. "How do you know?" shouted a voice from the back of the auditorium. "How do you know there aren't others? If Brooks fooled everyone for 8 years, how many more are still fooling you now?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud, because the truth was, they didn't know. They couldn't know. Brooks had proven that monsters could hide behind badges so effectively that even their closest colleagues couldn't detect them. The families of Brooks's victims faced a different kind of trauma. For 8 years, they'd clung to hope that their daughters might still be alive somewhere. That hope had been agonizing, but it had also been sustaining. Now, with definitive proof of death, they had to reconstruct their entire emotional landscape around a reality they'd tried desperately not to accept. Raymond Chen stood at his daughter's grave for the first time on a gray October morning, 4 months after her remains had been recovered from Brooks's property. Isabella's funeral had been delayed by the lengthy forensics process, but finally they could lay her to rest properly. "I keep thinking about all the times I thanked him," Raymond said to his wife Patricia as they placed flowers on Isabella's headstone. "All the times I shook his hand and told him how much we appreciated his dedication." Patricia Chen had aged a decade in the months since Brooks's arrest. The stress of reliving Isabella's disappearance through media coverage, legal proceedings, and her own traumatic memories had taken a visible toll. "Officer Brooks looked me in the eyes at Isabella's memorial service," she whispered. "Look me in the eyes and promised we'd find answers someday. And he knew. He knew she was already dead because he'd killed her." The psychological manipulation went beyond anything a typical murder case involved. Brooks hadn't just taken their daughter's life, he'd weaponized their grief, turned their hope into a tool for his own psychological satisfaction. Other families were grappling with similar revelations. Angela Rodriguez's mother had invited Brooks to family barbecues. Melissa Turner's father had recommended Brooks for a promotion. Samantha Walsh's sister had set up a scholarship fund and asked Brooks to serve on the selection committee. Each family had to confront the sickening realization that they'd been emotionally intimate with their daughter's killer, that they'd shared their most vulnerable moments with someone who'd taken pleasure in their suffering.
The legal proceedings began on October 15, 2017, with jury selection in the Oklahoma County Courthouse. Brooks's defense attorney, Marcus Reed, faced an impossible task, defending someone whose own journals documented 6 premeditated murders in horrific detail. Reed's strategy focused on mental illness, arguing that Brooks's crimes were the result of psychological disorders that had gone undiagnosed throughout his law enforcement career. It was the only possible defense, but it was also deeply offensive to the victims' families. Mental illness doesn't turn you into a serial killer, Angela Rodriguez's mother testified during the penalty phase. Mental illness doesn't make you torture innocent young women. Mental illness doesn't make you attend their funerals and comfort their families while knowing you're the reason they're grieving. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Lisa Zhang, had overwhelming evidence but faced a unique challenge, explaining how Brooks had operated undetected for so long without making the entire justice system look incompetent. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Zhang said during opening statements, "Daniel Brooks didn't succeed because our system failed. He succeeded because he exploited the very qualities that make law enforcement possible: trust, cooperation, and the assumption that officers sworn to protect and serve actually mean it." The trial lasted 6 weeks. 6 weeks of testimony from forensics experts, psychological evaluators, surviving family members, and Brooks's former colleagues who'd worked alongside him for years without suspecting his true nature. Detective Vasquez testified about the DNA evidence that had finally connected Brooks to Isabella's disappearance. Agent Chen presented the physical evidence found at Brooks's lake house. Pathologists explained how each victim had died. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source, Brooks himself. Against his attorney's advice, Brooks insisted on taking the stand in his own defense. Not because he believed he could convince the jury of his innocence, the evidence was too overwhelming for that, but because his narcissistic personality required him to be the center of attention. His testimony was chilling in its complete lack of remorse or emotional recognition of his crime's impact. "I was very good at my job," he repeated multiple times during cross-examination. "I solved more missing person cases than anyone else in the department's history." District Attorney Zhang pressed him repeatedly about his victims, trying to elicit some acknowledgement of their humanity. "Did you consider Isabella Chen's dreams of becoming a nurse when you killed her?" "I wasn't thinking about her career aspirations, no." "Did you think about her parents' love for her?" "Not specifically." "Did you consider that she had friends who cared about her?" "That wasn't relevant to my decision-making process." Brooks described his victims like objects he'd collected rather than human beings he'd murdered. His clinical detachment was so complete that several jurors visibly recoiled during his testimony. When asked about attending Isabella's memorial services and comforting her family, Brooks showed the closest thing to emotion he displayed throughout the trial: mild annoyance. "They kept asking for updates on the investigation. It would have been suspicious if I had avoided them entirely." He'd calculated his interactions with grieving families the same way he'd calculated everything else, as strategic moves in a game where only his interests mattered. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: 6 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of kidnapping, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations under color of law. The penalty phase took another week, during which family members were allowed to deliver victim impact statements directly to Brooks and the jury. Patricia Chen approached the witness stand with quiet dignity, carrying a photo of Isabella from her high school graduation. "Officer Brooks," she said, looking directly at him, "you didn't just kill my daughter, you killed her twice. Once when you took her life, and again every time you looked me in the eyes and pretended to care about finding her." Brooks stared back at her with the same empty expression he'd maintained throughout the trial. No recognition, no remorse, no acknowledgement that he was looking at a mother whose life he'd destroyed.
"You made me grateful to you,"
Patricia continued. You made me thank you for your service. You made me invite you into my home and treat you like family. That might be the cruelest thing you did, making me complicit in celebrating the man who'd murdered my child. Similar statements came from each victim's family. Stories of trust violated, hope manipulated, grief weaponized by someone who'd sworn an oath to protect and serve. The jury recommended death sentences for all 6 murders. Judge Harrison Wells accepted their recommendation, imposing 6 death sentences plus multiple life terms for the additional charges. Mr. Brooks, Judge Wells said during sentencing, in 30 years on this bench, I have never encountered someone who has so thoroughly corrupted the concept of justice. You didn't just commit murder, you perverted the very system designed to prevent and solve murders. Brooks listened to his sentencing with the same detached interest he'd shown throughout the trial. Even facing execution, he seemed more curious about the proceedings than concerned about their outcome. The impact on Norman extended far beyond the courtroom. Property values near Lake Thunderbird plummeted as the area became associated with Brooks's crimes. Several families moved away entirely, unable to live in a town where they'd been so thoroughly deceived. The Norman Police Department implemented sweeping reforms, mandatory psychological evaluations for all officers, enhanced oversight of evidence access, and new protocols for missing person investigations that required multiple investigators on every case. But the changes couldn't restore what had been lost, the fundamental trust between law enforcement and the community it served. How do we move forward? Asked Mayor Wells during a community meeting 6 months after Brooks's sentencing. How do we rebuild confidence in our police department? The answer came from an unexpected source. Isabella Chen's father. We move forward by remembering that Daniel Brooks was one person who betrayed everything law enforcement is supposed to represent. But Detective Vasquez,
Forensic science may never prove exactly how those infants died. The courts may never deliver a sentence that feels proportionate. But Jessica's house was not just a crime scene. It was a mirror. It showed us what happens when despair hides behind closed doors and no one dares to knock. It showed us the price of isolation in a world that prides itself on community. It showed us how easy it is to look away until the day we cannot. So where does this leave us? With responsibility. Not just to shake our heads at Jessica, but to open our eyes to the Jessicas who are still out there, to mothers in crisis unseen, to families falling apart behind curtains we never draw back. Because the truth is harsh. If we keep looking away, we will keep finding bodies. And by then, it will always be too late. Jessica Mothy may carry the legal blame, but the moral weight belongs to all of us. And the next time you see a neighbor struggling, the next time you hear cries muffled by thin walls, the next time you sense something is not right, ask yourself this: will you act or will you turn away? Because every silence we keep writes the next chapter in stories like this. If you've made it this far, don't just leave shaken, leave changed. Share Jessica's story, not to sensationalize, but to warn, to remind others that neglect thrives in silence. And if you want to be part of stopping the next Jessica Mothy, then take one simple step. Pay attention. Care enough to notice. Care enough to ask. Care enough to act. Because sometimes the difference between life and death is not in the courtroom, not in the autopsy, but in a neighbor who refuses to stay silent.